The day you realize hope cannot pay a bill is the day childhood truly ends. My name is Emily Carter, and at 25 years old, I had become an expert at surviving. Not living. Not dreaming. Just surviving. Every morning started before sunrise in a small apartment on the edge of Brooklyn where the radiator rattled louder than my alarm clock. I worked 2 jobs. One at a neighborhood bakery that smelled like cinnamon and fresh bread. Another at a grocery store 3 miles away where I spent evenings stocking shelves beneath fluorescent lights. It was not the life I imagined, but it kept food on the table and helped cover my mother's medical expenses. At least that was what I kept telling myself. The truth arrived on a gray Tuesday afternoon. Rain tapped softly against the apartment windows while I sorted through a pile of unopened envelopes. Most were bills. Some were final notices. One was different. The paper felt heavier. Official. Dangerous. My stomach tightened before I even opened it. By the time I finished reading, my hands were shaking. I read it again. Then a third time. The numbers did not change. The debt my late stepfather had hidden for years was real. Very real. More money than I could earn in a decade. More money than anyone I knew had ever seen. I sat motionless at the kitchen table while the rain continued outside. My mother was asleep in the next room, recovering from another exhausting treatment. She had no idea. I wanted to keep it that way. She had already suffered enough. For the next several hours I called banks, lawyers, collection agencies. Every conversation ended exactly the same way. Polite sympathy. No solution. By sunset, the apartment felt smaller than ever. The walls seemed to close in around me. Every unpaid bill looked like a countdown clock. Every shadow looked heavier. Then came the knock. 3 firm taps against the front door. Not aggressive. Not loud. Somehow that made it worse. I froze. Another knock followed. My pulse quickened as I crossed the room. When I opened the door, 2 professionally dressed men stood in the hallway. Dark coats. Serious expressions. Expensive watches. They did not look like anyone from the neighborhood. "Good evening, Miss Carter," one of them said. His voice remained calm and courteous. "We would like to discuss your financial situation." The words felt rehearsed. Precise. I gripped the edge of the door. "I think you have the wrong apartment." "We do not." He handed me a business card. The name printed across it meant nothing to me at the time. Yet something about it felt important. Significant. "We understand you are facing certain difficulties," he continued. "There may be an opportunity available to you." Opportunity. The word sounded almost absurd. My life was collapsing. Opportunity was the last thing I expected. Before I could ask another question, both men stepped aside. A black luxury sedan sat parked across the street beneath the rain. Its polished surface reflected the city lights. The rear passenger window was tinted dark enough that I could not see inside. "Who is that?" I asked quietly. The man glanced toward the car. Then back at me. "Someone who has taken an interest in your situation." A chill moved through me that had nothing to do with the weather. Standing there in the doorway, staring at that silent vehicle beneath the rain-soaked streetlights, I had the overwhelming feeling that my life had just crossed an invisible line, and whatever waited for me on the other side was about to change everything. The black sedan remained outside my apartment for nearly 10 minutes after the 2 men left. I watched from behind the curtain while rain slid down the glass in crooked lines. The car never moved. It never honked. No one stepped out. Somehow that silence felt more intimidating than any threat could have. Eventually, its headlights came on, and it disappeared into the night. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the stack of unpaid bills on my kitchen table. Every number felt larger in the dark. By morning, my head ached from exhaustion. I worked the early shift at the bakery anyway because missing work was not an option. It never had been. The smell of fresh bread usually comforted me. That morning it did nothing. My thoughts stayed trapped in a loop. Debt. Medical bills. Collection notices. The mysterious visitor. Around 10 o'clock my phone rang. Unknown number. Normally I would have ignored it. Instead I answered immediately. "Miss Carter," a calm male voice said. "We would like to invite you to a meeting this afternoon." I already knew who it was. I glanced toward the front window where customers moved past carrying umbrellas. "Why?" I asked. "Because someone would like to help you." The answer felt rehearsed. Who? There was a brief pause. Mr. Sebastian Hayes. The name meant nothing to me. Should it? Another pause. Most people know who he is. I did not. After ending the call, I searched his name online during my lunch break. The results appeared instantly. Business magazines, news articles, interviews, corporate awards. Sebastian Hayes was the founder and chief executive officer of Hayes Global Holdings, one of the largest investment firms in the country. His company owned office towers, technology firms, hotels, and more businesses than I could count. The photographs all looked the same. Dark suit, serious expression, sharp blue eyes. The media described him with words like brilliant, disciplined, ruthless, and untouchable. One article referred to him as the Ice King of Manhattan. I stared at the screen. People like Sebastian Hayes did not know people like me existed. Yet somehow he knew my name. At 4 o'clock, a car arrived outside the bakery. Not the same sedan from the night before. This one was even more expensive. The driver opened the rear door without speaking. Every instinct told me to walk away. Every unpaid bill told me otherwise. 45 minutes later, we arrived in Manhattan. Glass towers stretched into the cloudy sky. Luxury stores lined the streets. Everything looked polished and expensive. The vehicle stopped in front of a skyscraper that seemed to disappear into the clouds. Inside, the lobby was larger than my entire apartment building. Marble floors reflected golden light. Employees moved with quiet efficiency. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody wasted a second. A woman in a gray suit escorted me to a private elevator. We rode upward for what felt like forever. When the doors finally opened, I stepped into an office larger than any home I had ever seen. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city. The skyline stretched for miles in every direction. Standing near the glass was a tall man in a charcoal suit. His back faced me. One hand rested in his pocket. The other held a file. The woman beside me quietly stepped away. The office door closed behind us. Slowly the man turned around. For a moment neither of us spoke. His face matched every photograph I had seen online. Calm. Controlled. Impossible to read. His eyes settled on mine with unsettling focus. Then Sebastian Hayes said something that immediately changed the course of my life. He spoke only 6 words. I can solve your problem, Emily. For several seconds I simply stared at him. The city stretched behind him like something from another world. All glass and steel and impossible wealth. Meanwhile, I was still wearing the same bakery uniform I had worked in that morning. The contrast felt almost ridiculous. I can solve your problem, Emily. His words echoed in my head. Nobody had said anything like that since the debt surfaced. Everyone else offered sympathy. Sebastian Hayes offered certainty. What exactly does that mean? I asked. He walked toward his desk with the calm confidence of someone who never rushed for anything. Every movement seemed deliberate. Controlled. He picked up a folder and placed it in front of me. The number printed on the first page immediately made my stomach tighten. It was the exact amount of debt. Down to the last dollar. How do you know all of this? I asked quietly. I make it my business to know important things. Important things. I almost laughed. My entire life fit inside a 1-bedroom apartment with peeling paint and overdue bills. Nothing about me was important. Yet somehow this man knew details I had only learned days earlier. Sebastian returned to his seat and folded his hands. I will pay every cent. The debt disappears. Your mother's medical treatment continues without interruption. You keep your apartment if you wish. The words sounded unreal. Like a fantasy designed for desperate people. There has to be a catch. His expression never changed. There is an agreement. Of course there was. Relief and disappointment arrived. At the same moment. For a second I had almost believed miracles existed. What kind of agreement? Sebastian slid another document across the desk. I looked down. The pages were thick, professionally prepared, and covered with legal language. Most of it blurred together. One section stood out immediately. Residence requirement. I looked back at him. You want me to move into your house? Temporary residence, he corrected calmly. For how long? 1 year. The answer landed heavily. 1 year. 365 days. My entire life could change in a year. Why? The question escaped before I could stop it. Why me? For the first time, something shifted in his eyes. Not enough for me to understand it. Just enough to notice. Because this arrangement benefits both of us. That was not an answer. It felt like one carefully designed to avoid the truth. I continued reading. There was nothing inappropriate. No estrange demands. No unreasonable conditions. Healthcare coverage. Educational opportunities. Financial protection. Security. It looked less like a trap and more like a highly structured contract, which somehow made it even stranger. Most people would have signed immediately. I did not. Instead, I kept staring at the pages while questions multiplied inside my head. Who was this man? Why did he care? Why had he chosen me out of millions of people in New York City? The silence stretched between us. Finally, Sebastian spoke again. You do not have to decide today. That surprised me. You are giving me a choice? A faint smile appeared for less than a second before disappearing. Emily, a choice only matters when someone is free to refuse. I left his office an hour later carrying the contract in my hands. The driver took me back to Brooklyn as evening settled over the city. Streetlights flickered on. Rain clouds drifted away. Everything outside looked exactly the same. Yet nothing felt the same anymore. Because sitting inside my bag was a document capable of erasing every problem in my life. And deep down, what frightened me most was not the agreement itself. It was the growing feeling that Sebastian Hayes had been expecting me to walk into his office long before I ever knew his name. I spent 2 days pretending I had a decision to make. In reality, the numbers had already made it for me. Every bank account statement, every overdue notice, every medical bill sitting on my kitchen table pointed toward the same conclusion. By Thursday evening, I signed the agreement. The pen felt heavier than it should have. My mother watched quietly from across the room. She knew only part of the truth. I told her a private investor had offered assistance in exchange for helping with a charitable initiative connected to his company. It was not entirely false. It was simply not the whole story. She looked relieved for the first time in months. That alone made the choice feel worthwhile. The following morning, a moving company arrived at my apartment. Everything happened with unsettling efficiency. Boxes disappeared. Furniture vanished. Within hours, the small space that had been my home for years looked unfamiliar. Empty. Temporary. By noon, I was sitting in the back of another black sedan watching Brooklyn fade behind tinted windows. The drive into Manhattan felt strangely quiet. I kept expecting someone to explain what came next. Nobody did. When we finally arrived, tall iron gates opened automatically. Beyond them stood a property that looked less like a house and more like a private estate, hidden in the middle of the city. Stone walkways curved through carefully maintained gardens. Large windows reflected the afternoon sunlight. The front entrance alone was larger than my entire apartment. I stepped out of the vehicle and stared upward. This cannot be real, I whispered. A woman in an elegant navy suit greeted me at the door. Welcome, Miss Carter. My name is Victoria. I manage the household. Household. The word sounded like something from another century. She guided me through hallways lined with artwork, polished wood floors, and towering windows overlooking the city skyline. Everything felt quiet, controlled, perfect. No television noise. No traffic echoing through thin walls. No neighbors arguing through the ceiling. The silence was almost intimidating. Eventually, Victoria opened a door near the end of the second floor. This will be your suite. Suite. Not room. Suite. The space inside was larger than my old apartment. A sitting area overlooked the gardens. A bedroom occupied the far side. Sunlight spilled across cream-colored furniture and shelves already stocked with books. Fresh flowers sat near the window. Someone had prepared everything before I arrived. The realization sent an uncomfortable chill through me. How long had they been expecting me? After Victoria left, I wandered through the room alone. My suitcase sat neatly beside the bed. Everything looked beautiful. None of it felt like mine. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. When I opened the door, Sebastian stood in the hallway. Charcoal suit. Calm expression. Hands in his pockets. Somehow he looked exactly as he had in his office. Perfectly composed. I expected instructions. Rules. A lecture about expectations. Instead, His gaze moved briefly around the room before returning to me. Is everything acceptable? That was his first question. Not are you settled? Not remember our agreement. Simply whether I was comfortable. I nodded. Think so. A faint pause followed. Then he said something even more surprising. If anything here makes you unhappy, it can be changed. The statement caught me off guard. Why? Because you are not a guest, Emily. The answer should have reassured me. Somehow it raised even more questions. Sebastian studied me for a moment before turning toward the staircase. Dinner is at 7. There is no requirement to attend. Then he walked away. I watched him disappear down the hallway, more confused than ever. Because cold men did not usually care whether someone felt comfortable. And for the first time since entering his world, I began to wonder if the person everyone described in magazines was not the person standing in front of me at all. I spent my first week in Sebastian Hayes's estate waiting for the mask to slip. Every article I had read described him as ruthless. Every business interview painted him as a man who viewed the world through numbers and contracts. Surely the version I met could not be real. Surely there was a reason behind every act of kindness. Yet the days passed and nothing happened. No hidden demands. No unexpected conditions. No reminders about the agreement. If anything, Sebastian seemed determined to give me more freedom than I expected. I returned to work at the bakery 3 days after moving in. I assumed someone from his office would object. Nobody did. In fact, a car simply arrived every morning and every evening without a single comment. One rainy Tuesday, I walked into the kitchen before dawn and found Sebastian already there. The sight surprised me. For some reason, I imagined powerful executives sleeping until someone handed them a schedule. Instead, he stood by the counter pouring coffee while reviewing documents. You are awake early, I said. His eyes lifted briefly. So are you? The answer almost sounded like a joke. Almost. I grabbed a muffin and prepared to leave. Then I noticed something unusual. A stack of medical paperwork sat beside him. My mother's name appeared on the top page. Instantly, my stomach tightened. Why do you have those? Sebastian closed the folder calmly. Because I wanted to ensure her treatment continues without delays. The response should have reassured me. Instead, it left me speechless. Most people offered help when it was convenient. Sebastian handled problems before they happened. Later that afternoon, I received a call from the hospital. They informed me that several future treatments had already been approved and scheduled. No complications. No dilas. No financial concerns. After hanging up, I sat alone in the employee break room staring at my phone. For months I had fought every day just to keep my mother receiving proper care. Somehow, within a week, Sebastian had solved issues I could never fix alone. The confusion growing inside me became impossible to ignore. That evening I returned to the estate earlier than usual. As I crossed the front hallway, voices drifted from a nearby study. The door was slightly open. Normally I would have continued walking. Then I heard my name. I stopped. A man I did not recognize sat across from Sebastian. The visitor looked frustrated. You are investing an extraordinary amount of time into this situation, he said. Sebastian's expression remained unreadable. I am aware. The man leaned back. Most people would not do this for a stranger. A long silence followed. Then Sebastian replied with a sentence that made my heart stop. Emily is not a stranger. The words echoed through the room. Before I could hear anything else, footsteps approached from the opposite hallway. I quickly moved away before anyone noticed me. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Not a stranger. What did that mean? We had met only days ago. At least that was what I believed. Yet the certainty in his voice suggested something entirely different. Later that night, I stood beside my bedroom window overlooking the illuminated gardens below. A light remained on in the study across the estate. Sebastian was still working, still awake, still carrying responsibilities large enough to fill entire companies. Yet somehow, somewhere within all of that, he had found room to care about a struggling bakery employee from Brooklyn. And for the first time, a question appeared that frightened me far more than the debt ever had. What if Sebastian Hayes knew far more about me than I knew about him? The question followed me everywhere after that night. It lingered during my shifts at the bakery. It sat beside me during hospital visits with my mother. It waited quietly in the back of my mind every time I saw Sebastian across a hallway or at the dinner table. What did he mean when he said I was not a stranger? The simplest explanation was that he had investigated my background before offering help. Powerful people did that all the time. Yet something about the way he said it felt personal. Familiar. As if the answer had nothing to do with business. A week later, I found myself wandering through a rarely used section of the estate, while searching for a quiet place to read. The property was enormous. Even after a month, I still discovered rooms I had never seen. At the end of one hallway, I noticed a small library tucked behind a pair of wooden doors. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating rows of books and leather chairs. The room felt different from the rest of the house. Less formal. More lived in. I moved toward a shelf near the back and stopped. A framed photograph sat partially hidden between several books. It looked old. At least 10 years old. My breath caught. The picture showed a community charity event in Brooklyn. Children stood around folding tables covered with donated school supplies. Volunteers smiled toward the camera. And there, near the center of the photograph, was me. Younger. Maybe 15 years old. Holding a cardboard box and smiling at something outside the frame. My heart immediately started racing. I picked up the photograph with trembling hands. Why was this here? Why would Sebastian have a picture taken in a neighborhood he had no connection to? Footsteps sounded behind me. I turned too quickly. Sebastian stood in the doorway. For the first time since meeting him, genuine surprise crossed his face. Neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us. Then his gaze shifted to the photograph in my hands. Something changed in his expression. Not panic. Not anger. Resignation. As though a secret he had protected for years had finally reached its expiration date. I looked from the picture back to him. What is this? My voice sounded smaller than intended. Sebastian remained still for several seconds. Then he slowly walked into the room. I attended that event, he said quietly. I stared at him. 10 years ago? Yes. The answer created more questions than it solved. Why? He glanced toward the photograph. My company sponsored the program. I was there for less than an hour. I should have been focused on investors and publicity. Instead, his voice softened slightly. I noticed a girl carrying supplies to every table because she thought the volunteers were overwhelmed. I remembered that day. Barely. The organizers had been short-handed. I spent the afternoon helping because it felt like the right thing to do. You remember that? I asked. Sebastian looked directly into my eyes. Every detail. My pulse quickened. The room suddenly felt too quiet. Too small. The distance between us seemed charged with years I did not understand. For a decade I had never heard his name. Yet somehow he remembered mine. Then he said something that left me completely speechless. Emily, finding you again was the one thing in my life that happened exactly the way I hoped it would. For a long moment I could not speak. The photograph felt heavier in my hands than it had seconds earlier. 10 years. The number echoed through my mind again and again. 10 years ago, I was a teenager worried about helping my mother pay rent and keeping my grades high enough to earn scholarships. Meanwhile, somewhere in that same crowd, Sebastian Hayes had noticed me. The idea seemed impossible. You remembered me for 10 years? I finally asked. My voice barely rose above a whisper. Sebastian looked toward the window before answering. Not every day. Not every moment. But I never forgot. The honesty in his tone unsettled me more than any elaborate explanation could have. People forgot names. Faces. Entire relationships. Yet somehow this man remembered a stranger carrying boxes at a community event. Why? The question escaped before I could stop it. Sebastian's jaw tightened slightly. It was the first visible sign of discomfort I had ever seen from him. Because everyone else was trying to be noticed. You were trying to help. I stared at him. That cannot be enough. A faint smile touched his face. You would be surprised. The room fell silent again. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting golden reflections across the bookshelves. Everything around us remained calm while my thoughts raced in every direction. Suddenly dozens of moments from the past several weeks looked different. The immediate knowledge of my debt. The medical arrangements. The way he seemed to anticipate problems before I mentioned them. None of it felt random anymore. You knew who I was before those men came to my apartment, I said. It was not a question. Sebastian nodded once. How long? Several months. The answer should have angered me. Instead, it only deepened the mystery. Several months? Then why wait? Why not contact me earlier? Because I did not want gratitude. I wanted a reason that gave you a choice. I looked away. The response sounded frustratingly sincere. Most powerful people used influence to get what they wanted. Sebastian seemed to be doing the opposite. He kept creating opportunities for me to walk away. Later that evening, I could not stop thinking about the conversation. During dinner, I found myself studying him whenever he was not looking. The calm expression, the measured movements, the way staff members respected him without fear. For the first time, I noticed something else. Loneliness. Not obvious. Not dramatic. Just small details. The oversized dining room designed for 20 people but usually occupied by one. The long stretches of silence he seemed accustomed to. The way he lingered after conversations ended, as though he secretly wished they would continue. After dinner, I stepped onto a terrace overlooking the city. Night had settled over Manhattan. Thousands of lights stretched toward the horizon. A few minutes later, the door opened behind me. I already knew who it was. Beautiful view, I said. Sebastian joined me near the railing. It is better tonight. Why? He looked directly at me. Because I am not looking at it alone. My heart stumbled unexpectedly. Neither of us spoke after that. The city hummed below. A cool breeze moved through the gardens. And standing there beneath the glow of Manhattan's skyline, I realized the biggest secret was not that Sebastian Hayes had remembered me for 10 years. The biggest secret was that he had spent all that time waiting for a chance to be remembered by me. After that night on the terrace, something changed between us. Not dramatically. Not all at once. It happened in small moments that would have seemed insignificant to anyone else. Morning coffee already waiting on the kitchen counter because Sebastian remembered how I liked it. A message asking how my mother was feeling after an appointment. Quiet conversations that stretched later into the evening than either of us intended. The distance that once existed between us gradually disappeared. Yet one question continued to follow me. If Sebastian had known about me for years, then how much of what happened afterward was truly coincidence? The answer arrived on a rainy afternoon in early spring. I had taken the day off from the bakery to help my mother settle into a new treatment schedule. When I returned to the estate, Victoria met me in the hallway with an unusual expression. Mr. Hayes is in the study, she said. He asked if you would join him when you returned. Something in her tone made my pulse quicken. I found Sebastian standing near the window, looking out at the rain falling across the gardens. A folder rested on the desk beside him. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then he turned and gestured toward the chair across from him. Please sit down. The seriousness in his voice immediately caught my attention. He said. Sebastian picked up the folder and placed it in front of me. Inside were documents, reports, and records spanning several years. At first, I did not understand what I was seeing. Then patterns began to emerge. Medical grants, anonymous donations, scholarship funds, assistance programs. My name appeared again and again. I looked up in disbelief. What is this? Sebastian exhaled slowly. The truth. My heart started pounding. He explained everything. Years ago, after seeing me at that community event, he occasionally followed updates through the charitable organization his company supported. When he learned about my mother's illness, he quietly arranged financial assistance through programs designed to protect privacy. When my college scholarship unexpectedly increased during my second year, it had come from one of those funds. When a landlord gave me extra time during a difficult period, someone had already guaranteed the missing payments. Every time life seemed to give me a small break, Sebastian had been somewhere behind the scenes. Invisible. Silent. Never asking for recognition. I could barely process what I was hearing. Why would you do all this? I asked. His eyes never left mine. Because I cared. The simplicity of the answer made it even harder to absorb. You never even knew me. I knew enough. Tears threatened to form. For years I had believed I survived entirely on my own. Now I was discovering that someone had been quietly protecting my future, without ever expecting anything in return. Then Sebastian said the one thing that finally made everything clear. The debt was not what brought me into your life, Emily. It was simply the first time I could help openly instead of from a distance. The room became very quiet. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Somewhere beyond the glass, the city continued moving through another ordinary afternoon. Yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. Because the man I once believed had rescued me through a contract was revealing something far greater. He had never been trying to own my future. For 10 years, he had simply been trying to protect it. The truth changed everything, but not in the way I expected. For days after our conversation in the study, I walked through the estate feeling as though I were seeing it for the first time. The grand hallways no longer looked like symbols of wealth. The gardens no longer felt intimidating. Every corner carried a memory I had never known existed. Somewhere behind every opportunity, every unexpected blessing, every moment when life became slightly easier, Sebastian had been there. Not demanding attention, not asking for gratitude, simply helping. The realization stayed with me long after the shock faded. One evening in late spring, my mother and I sat together on a bench overlooking a small lake in Central Park. Her health had improved dramatically over the past several months. Color had returned to her face. Her smile appeared more often. Watching her laugh at something a child said nearby felt like witnessing a miracle. She looked at me carefully. "You love him." The statement arrived so suddenly that I nearly laughed. Instead, I stared across the water. Do I make it that obvious? Only to a mother. I smiled despite myself. The strange thing was that she was right. Somewhere between the contract, the secrets, and the years of quiet devotion, my feelings had changed. Not because Sebastian rescued me. Not because he was successful. Not because of the estate or the influence or the life he could offer. I loved him because he saw value in people long before the rest of the world did. He had seen it in me when I was 15 years old carrying boxes at a charity event. He still saw it now. A week later, Sebastian invited me to dinner. Nothing unusual about that. We had shared countless meals already. Yet something felt different from the moment we left the city. The driver followed a winding road north of Manhattan until the skyline disappeared behind trees and rolling hills. Eventually, we arrived at a small private garden overlooking the Hudson River. Strings of warm lights hung between the trees. The sun was setting beyond the water, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber. For several minutes, we simply walked together through the garden. No business calls interrupted him. No assistants appeared with schedules. The world seemed unusually quiet. Finally, we stopped beside the river. Sebastian looked out across the water before speaking. "Do you remember the first question you asked me in my office?" I thought back. There had been many. Then I remembered. "Why me?" He nodded slowly. "You never received a complete answer." My heart began to race. The evening breeze moved gently through the trees around us. Sebastian turned toward me. For 10 years, I told myself admiration would eventually fade. It never did. I told myself distance would make it easier. It did not. And when I learned about the debt, I realized something. If I let that moment pass, I would regret it for the rest of my life. His voice remained calm, but the emotion behind it was unmistakable. "Emily, I never wanted to own your future. I only wanted the chance to be part of it." Tears filled my eyes before I could stop them. Not because the words were dramatic, because they were true. Every one of them. I stepped closer and took his hand. For the first time since meeting him, the guarded expression disappeared completely. The man standing before me was no longer the distant executive from magazine covers. He was simply Sebastian, the person who waited 10 years without asking for anything in return. The person who taught me that love is not measured by promises spoken loudly. It is measured by loyalty practiced quietly. And as the sun disappeared beyond the river, and the lights around us began to glow, I finally understood something that would stay with me forever. The greatest acts of love are often the ones nobody sees until the story is almost over.